10. Так, а как, собственно... Господи Боже. Сейчас тут что-то поменялось, и я никак не могу понять, как вам выслать ссылку. Что ж такое? А, вот. Абсолютно. Сейчас я могу подвинуть. Сейчас. Так, куда я скидываю в GEM 2025? Так, я скинула GEM 2025, приглашение сейчас на ссылку, ссылку на конференцию. Тогда выключаем звук сразу. Так.
What microphones? Dynamics.
Microphone as well.
This is for the recording. You keep microphones and speakers off, I guess both.
Сейчас я буду.
Okay.
So, shall we start? We start? So, we can start.
Start sharing the screen.
Сегодня будем смотреть модель новую, не ту, в которой я работаю, в которой вы будете работать. Да. Что, мы начинаем, коллеги? Okay, we are ready to receive your wisdom. Please start.
Okay. So I hope that you can see the screen with the model.
Yes.
Stop me anytime if something is not clear. Feel free to ask questions as needed, because we change topic pretty quickly from one sector to the other. So first, since you're familiar with Benzene, you will see some differences compared to the version that probably you use. This is an earlier version of Benzene DSS, the full version of the software. The icons likely look a little bit different, but the software is exactly the same. It does exactly the same when you click on a tool, it does exactly the same. It's just that it looks maybe a bit different depending on the icon that is used. Then what I want you to look at is the left side of the screen with the full list of the components, the sketches, or they're called also views of the model. So this is a list that you can make appear. When you click at the bottom left corner, you see we have population there. If you click on population, then the full list of sketches comes up. It's the same when you use Excel and you have a number of different sheets in your file. You right-click on the left side when you have the first one, or when you have the arrows going left and right, and it shows you the full list of all the sheets in the Excel file. This is basically the same. And also here, if you click on the very bottom of the list, you see new. This is where you're going to add new modules if you want to add some new components to the model. There are different theories for how to build models. Some people, like some of my professors, say the model has to be in one sketch, in one view.
The whole model.
The whole model. But then if it gets very big, you scroll top, you scroll down, you scroll left, you scroll right. It's complicated. Others say break it down in more smaller components. Just make sure that the content fits within the screen, so that every time you open it, everything is there, right? So this is a theory, and then in practice, we end up doing a mix of the two. Sometimes there's small models, sometimes they grow a bit bigger. But the idea here is that we break down the structure of the model based on the thematic areas, thematic components. So I would suggest we start from population, this first one that you see on the screen. You will notice that above population, we have the climate impact, inputs, the functions, the damages, and the impacts and adaptation options. We'll get to those later. Let's start with the underlying key sectors like population, the economy, and so on. Okay. So now that you've gone through the course and you're soon to be experts, soon to be, not yet, it's soon to be. What do you see in this diagram? What are the first things that you notice? There is one stock at the center, right? That's important, the stock of population.
Flow from the population.
Right. There is one flow in, there is no flow out, right? So that already tells you that you have a stock of people that accumulates and that the flow is a net flow. It's the net value between fertility and mortality in this case. Right? So if you know in reality, you will have an inflow and an outflow, fertility and mortality. In this case, one is the net change in population, right? So the flow can be a net flow. The other hint you get is that the variables affecting the change in population are population itself, and that's fine. But then if you look at the left side, the net population growth rate. So if it's a net population growth rate, again, it considers both the increase and the decline, okay? Then there is one aspect also to note concerning the net population growth rate. I'll just close this one. And that is that you have table in the variable name. So as a convention, when we use data, external data, we change the variable name and we indicate there that there is data input in that variable. And that's why I use table in the variable name. If you look at the variable, when you open the pop-up equation tool, right, the window with the variable, you see that this is a lookup. It's a table function, and you have all the data in the second part of the equation. If you click on sgraph, then you will see the time series. These are actual data, historical data, and the forecast on the net rate of change of population, percentage per year. Okay. I don't know if you've stopped me anytime, again, if something is not clear, but if you want to use data inputs into the model, like a time series, like in this case, you can go to Excel, prepare your data series. It has to be horizontal, meaning that you have the variable in rows and time in columns. Then you copy the full time series. You can come here, click on import values, and that basically imports the full time series into the model. Yes?
The annual growth rate, so the growth rate for 1 year Is it compared to some basis year or to
Previous.
to the full?
Yes, yes. Otherwise, it would be an index,
Mhm.
right? If you have 2000 equals 1, and then you have the index.
Mhm.
This is just the annual rate of change, percent change compared to the previous year.
Okay.
Then one more comment on population. It could be modeled in more detail. So we could model fertility, mortality separately. We could say that fertility is affected by income, by education, divided by gender. Mortality is impacted by access to healthcare. So it really depends on the goals of your exercise, right? How much depth and detail you add to estimate some variables. In this case, changing population trends is not our priority, right? That's why it's simplified in this version of the model. And when you look at this time series, you see it goes all the way to 2055. You can also scroll down to see up to what point we have data. And these are taken from the World Population Prospects of the United Nations. They generate forecasts for population growth for every country in the world. It's the benchmark. It's what everyone uses. And so this is where we gather this data to make sure that we have a reliable forecast on total population. Of course, if you have national forecast, it can be replaced by the population growth rate you get from these forecasts. Could be any input, but you start from a solid basis in a way. Okay. Questions about the module otherwise? Everything clear? A stock, a net flow. That's it, right?
What is it 1 year delay time?
So here we have the net population growth rate as an input, right? In this case at the top, we calculate it as an output. Okay. So to calculate it as an output, knowing that the annual growth rate is the value of this year compared to the value of the previous year, we need to tell the software, give me the current value and give me the value that you had a year ago. And so this 1 year delay time is to say, what was the value last year, right? So if you look at the equation, there is a built-in function called trend in the software. This is what you find under all the pre-built-in functions you have here on the left side. This trend, you define the input, that is population. You introduce the delay time, 1 year, and then you have to indicate what is the initial trend, 0% growth rate, 2% growth rate. And then the model calculates the trend, that 1 year delay process, to estimate what was the growth rate. And you see the shape is very similar to the one we have in the data. Okay. So this is to compare and validate, right? So if you want to build a model on your own, what I always say is don't start typing in 10 variable names. Start with one, and then add a second one, and then connect the two, add the equation, the unit of measure, run the model, test that everything is fine. Then add a third one, add the equations, the units, run the model, make sure everything is fine. Then add the fourth and the fifth, add the variables, the equations, and check it. In this case as well, I trust the data, okay? But I want to double check that my model works. So I also add in what we normally call a control variable, right? To see if you're actually reproducing the input that we want to use. Okay? So in every sketch, or more or less in every sketch, most, you will find an extra variable or two that are there for validation purposes. Either to compare against data or to make sure the calculations are fine. Because it happens very often and you will say, oh yes, this is the method to calculate that variable. You run the model and you get something weird, and then you realize you made a mistake. Right? So if you add the new variable and the control variable, you will figure it out right away where the problem is. In this case, it's just the same, but the model is set up so that if you want to, you can break down population by age cohort. And so in that case, you have the population divided by gender and age, or you have the total population that sums up the total value overall. The equation tool, the one at the top, that the one with the function of x in red, This is the one that when you click on a variable, it pops up that variable definition.
Yeah, this version of fencing different.
Yours more updated.
Mine is older because
The full version.
it's the full version and it's older because I want to avoid any bugs that come with the new software. I stay with the reliable version until I know I can transition.
And besides, it's like
Sometimes
This is the one you have,
Yeah.
I guess. You have Vensim PLE, right? You have Vensim PLE and the icons look like the ones you see on the screen now, right? They're actually in the same position. They do exactly the same. This one, it's the same f function of x. They just change the look to modernize it a little bit. That's all. No problem. Now, there are certain variables, like population in this case, that embed a series of other sub-variables. And we will see that soon. This is what we call subscript, meaning that we may have, in this case, power generation, but we have one variable for power generation that includes a number of different technologies. And subscripts are used to make so that you don't have to create 10 or 15 or 20 variables, one for each technology. Same with population. If we divide population by age cohort, we have 80 plus age cohorts. You can see them here, actually 102 pre-set in the model. And then we add gender. Then we have 204 variables in the model. With subscripts, you embed them in one single stock, as opposed to having 204 separate variables, one for each age cohort and gender. This is just from a template of the model, the green economy model. So this is a customized version to Kyrgyzstan, but we had pre-filled in data for a number of other countries that we don't use in this case. So you don't need to look at the country subscript in this case. That's no use. Actually, I can remove it. It's not being actively used. Good. Should we proceed? No problem. Then, if you look at the list of sectors or modules or components, we go into the economy. We have households and government. So these are the households accounts. So it's not households as representing number of people that live in a household and so on. This is the household account in the national economic accounts, meaning the revenues, the expenditure, savings, and investments of households as an economic actor. Okay, so when you read household, in this case, is economic accounting for households. And so citizens, it's basically citizens, right? In the economic accounts, you have government, households, banks, and the rest of the world.
citizens, because for us, when we do startup, household is also important. Who is head of household, for example, number, but it's all here, it's like in terms of the revenue.
It's the aggregate.
But why it's counting citizens not in the currency, for example, or kind
Oh, no. So the unit of measure is monetary. It's sum per year, right? But the household in this case represents the people, basically, right? So it's not the business because that's value added in GDP. It's not government because you have government accounts. It's not the banks and it's not the rest of the world. It's just the sum of the wealth generated by the people.
And the per capita. Right?
You can divide by total population and you get per capita. Yes. Yeah. So what you see in this diagram, it's not something we have invented. This is just a reproduction of how the households accounts work in the manual of the International Monetary Fund. And it's the manual that is being used by every country in the world to develop national accounts. The starting point is GDP that you see here on the left side. Something interesting to see, this is in gray and with small brackets on the side. This is what we call a shadow variable, or in a way, a variable that is calculated somewhere else, but we bring it up and we use it here. You have a tool here at the top called shadow variable. If you click on this one and then click anywhere on the screen, then you have the full list of variables in the model, and you can search and pick the one you want. And I'll just pick one, agriculture emissions, and it shows up in gray by default. So, and with the brackets, so that you know this is not calculated here, it's coming from somewhere else. It's like working in Excel. When you want to add a link to another sheet, for instance, you say equals, and then you click on a tab on the other sheet, and then click on the cell. It's basically connecting from one part of the model to another. But if you delete this variable, it disappears here and in the other sector where you have created it. Well, in Excel, if you create a connection, but you remove the equation, when you have that connection, you just remove your own equation. You don't remove the source value. In this case, you remove the source value as well. Then the equation does not calculate. So it goes the other way around, right? So if you delete the source, this one disappears as well. The agricultural emission disappears from here as well. But if you delete agricultural emissions from here, it disappears there also. So when you delete, there are different ways to do that. I'll just give you a few hints on how to use the software as we remove the model in case you're not aware. If you click on the hand tool, select the variable, instead of using the trash bin, right, that deletes everything. If you click on cancel or the delete button on your keyboard, then you have options. You can remove from this view, but do not change the model structure, which is what we normally do. Or if you go at the top, it's the complete removal, delete the variable, the shadow variable, and change the model. Right? So the one at the top is like the trash bin. You delete everything. If you just add it because you want to use it here and you realize you don't need it anymore, then use the first option. Remove from this view, but do not change the model. And then it just disappears from this view, but it's still in the model. Okay? So important inputs, GDP as a key driver for determining the value of the economy for households. You will see that this is real GDP. Real means it's inflation adjusted, right? So constant terms, right? Let me know if you have problems understanding the real nominal inflation adjusted or not. I can explain quickly. And so we take the real GDP because production is measured in real terms. We apply the GDP deflator so we can turn it into nominal, not inflation adjusted, because all the government accounts are not inflation adjusted. They look at the value of money in a given year, not the purchasing power accounting for inflation. Production accounts for the purchasing power and inflation, the accounts don't. Okay? Then we have nominal production that goes on to affect disposable income. So disposable income is, out of everything that is being produced, what remains with households. And so we take production, value added, GDP, and then we subtract the revenue of the government, which is taxation. So it's the amount of money that you move from households to government. So you subtract it from GDP, right? And then we take the interest on public debt, right? Because that's also money that is an exchange between the government and households. So what is left is disposable income. So you can click on the equation tool, look at disposable income, and that is production minus revenues, government revenues, plus interest on public debt. Right? Because the revenue the government receives, I pay as a citizen, it's my tax on income. But if I buy public debt, I receive interest from the government. Okay? Then once we have disposable income, we can decide how to allocate it. Normally there is either consumption, savings, or investment. That's normally what we do with our money, right? We keep it in a bank account, we spend it to buy food, or we invest it. So it disappears from our bank account because it goes somewhere else to work, right? Possibly. So in the model, given that we have a supply side approach, we are looking at the potential to produce as the primary driver for economic activity, the most important allocation is investment. How much is invested? Consumption doesn't matter so much. Consumption will matter more in a demand-driven economy, right? Could be the United States, Europe, and so on. So we first determine consumption and then subtract consumption from income to have savings. And once you have savings, we divide it into what stays in the bank account and what goes into investment. It's what stays in the bank account. It's the same. It stays somewhere as a saving, right? If it's informal, we don't capture it because we use official data, right? So if there is an informal economy, either we modify the data inputs to account for that, or it doesn't show up in official statistics. So just briefly, what we do then is we take disposable income, we turn it into a per capita value per person, and then we want to determine the propensity to consume. Again, not something I've invented myself. There is literature on how to determine what the consumption level is. And that consumption level comes out of your propensity to consume. Now, the theory says that when you have little money, you consume all of it, right? When you start making more money, you set aside parts of it, right? When you make a lot of money, you set aside more of it, right? So the percentage that is dedicated to consumption is very high when you have little money and becomes smaller when you make more money, because your basic needs are being addressed by the first $200 you make every month, right? Not considered here. It would happen, say, in the United States, where the average person has a debt, it doesn't have money in the bank account, is in the red, then your propensity to consumption would be above 1. In that case, you show that you have a national debt at the household level. So we look at the World Bank data. There is an initial value for the propensity to consume. There is a time series as well on consumption. And we can then calculate what is the relationship between per capita income and consumption, so that this variable propensity to consume is calibrated to match the income value and the consumption value. So the theory is aligned across all countries, but the parameterization is based on data for Kyrgyzstan specifically. Yes. So we have an initial value that is also time series, depending on the data we have. We multiply it by the relative per capita disposable income, an index for income growth, to the power of an elasticity. The elasticity determines the strength of the relationship between income and the propensity to consume. So if your income is growing very fast, but your consumption is growing at a lower pace, we use a small elasticity, 0.1, 0.2. It means that your propensity to consume is not sensitive to changes in income, okay? If instead your propensity to consume changes very quickly and at the same pace as your change in income, meaning that the more you make, the more you spend proportionally, then in that extreme case, the elasticity will be 1. There is a 1-to-1 relationship between the change in income and the change in consumption. Okay.
Sorry, why don't you have a polarity here?
Good question. First, because it takes time to add it to every single variable. Second, because the polarity is in the equation. You infer it from the equation. So if you look at disposable income, it's nominal production. So it would be plus nominal production.
Okay.
So that would be a plus on the arrow.
Yes, just
Yeah.
yeah.
Then you have minus government revenue. You say, okay, that arrow then would be with a minus sign, because the higher government revenue, the lower disposable income. So the polarity is embedded in the equation you build in.
Polarity because
No.
we use formulas.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. So you can get that confirmation from the formula, and it's in your head anyway. And it should be based on theory somewhere, and some papers and reports that you can use as reference.
If it's a closed loop diagram, then you would use polarity to show the logic of the sector.
So when
In the causal diagram.
Causal
in
diagram.
course,
Because you don't have the equation there. There you're presenting your own understanding. And so it makes sense to show the plus and minus to be fully aligned. But here, being quantified, it's stated in the equation.
thank you.
So then you know, when you open the graphs, right? Let's say you have GDP. Let me do it this way to be faster. There are a few tricks that you can activate when you work with the full version of the software, like that every time I click on a variable, the graph shows up to make it a bit faster, right? So there are certain time-saving options, right? So here you see total real GDP, right? It's increasing. We see 2 lines in this case. We see a red line being the historical data, and we see the blue line being the model forecast. The model runs from the year 2000 until 2050. Historical data from 2000 until 2000, in this case, 29, I believe, because we have forecasts from the IMF, from the World Economic Outlook, until 2029 or 2030. Let me see. Last data point. Oh, 2027, 28, 2028 for
Wow.
Kyrgyzstan. They release updates every once in a while, but they don't update all the countries at the same time. So you want the long or the short answer? Because the long answer is we need to go through the whole model so that you understand it. But the short answer is that the model reproduces the GDP data because the inputs to GDP reflect data on investment, employment, productivity. And the data on investment reflect GDP. So you have the match comes out of the fact that the equations that we built into the model are able to reproduce reality over time. And if you're able to reproduce reality on investment, employment, and productivity, which are the three key factors affecting GDP, then you're going to match the trend for GDP, right? And by extension, if you match the trend for GDP, given that GDP affects energy demand together with population, and we see the population has a very good fit with the data, then we'll also be able to match energy demand. So we're basically making so that if you have data on population, energy, the economy, emissions, if the model works well, we're able to reproduce the trends of every single key indicator across the different sectors. But that also means that if one indicator is off, everything else is off. Like if GDP was growing exponentially very, very quickly, then energy demand would be too high, right? Emissions will be too high. They don't match the data. So we need to go back and fix, right, and adjust. But basically, we match the data because there are equations that are able to reproduce historical trends. And different variables are affected by different equations and different data inputs. What is important, though, is that the data that we use are not driving the model, right? That is important. System dynamics models work with an initial value, that is your anchor, in a way, right? It's your initial parameterization for the model. Then the model runs differential equations. What it means is that it takes the initial value and then it says, what is the change between 1st of January 2000 and 1st of February 2000? So the model computes the change based on the initial value, right? And it does that every single time step. So we have a time step of, what is it now? The time step is 1 month, 8.3% of a year, right? That's 1 month. And so every month, the model is recalculating every single variable in the model, right? The software is recalculating every single variable in the model, and it looks at the cumulative compounding change that is happening between stocks and flows across. The blue line is the model simulation, yes. So if you work with an econometric model, for those familiar with econometric models, you take the historical time series, you look at correlation between two variables, and then develop the relationship going forward, right? If you have gaps in data, it's a problem because it means that the relationship may not be measured in a solid way, right? In this case, instead, the red line is not an input to the model. The red line is data that we use to compare if our output works well. Yes, the red line is just data, but not an input. So this is the historical time series with GDP at the national level.
Yes.
And the last 4 years, the next 4 years, until 2028 or so, is the GDP of the country applying the annual growth rate that the IMF is forecasting. In Excel, yes.
Yes.
I continue the time series, right? I take the last data point for GDP from the country, statistics, and then I see the IMF is forecasting a 6% growth rate. I calculate the next GDP value, adding 6% to the previous data point. So we have that consistent time series. Yeah, and this is just a case of GDP, but there are more.
Something. Then also
Anything. Yeah, anything that you think is realistic. Any source. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so moving ahead on this module, and I'll spend more time on this one to understand the mechanics, and I'll be a bit faster on the other ones. But we have the income, right? We have the GDP, we have production, we have income. The fit is not perfect in this case. We are a bit underestimating the revenues. But at the same time, if we go ahead and we look at the other variables, like investment, we match that better. So sometimes it happens that there is an inconsistency in the data where you have certain variables that are a bit higher than they should be. And if you match them, then you're underestimating another variable. So in this case, I prefer to make sure that we match better the last data points for investment as opposed to matching the data points for income or consumption. Because investment is what flows back into the economy. Now, how do we know that? This is important that we start exploring how the model works. If we take nominal investment and we use the uses tree tool, we have causes and we have uses. The uses tree tool tells us where this variable is being used. Again, very similar tool in Excel. When you have a cell, you can check where this is being used and you have the arrows that appear on the screen to figure out where this is being picked up by other equations, let's say. This is basically the same. So we know that nominal investment is used to estimate.
Sorry.
Yes?
Just do time.
Yeah, you select the variable you want, like nominal investment in this case, and then the uses tree. You have the causes that tell you what is being used to arrive at this variable. Yes.
This one is very useful.
Causes at the top and uses just below. These two on the left side. Yeah. In the same position, they just changed. No. There is no, I mean, the advantage for the old one is that you see A and B affecting C, right? And in the other case, you have C affecting D and E. They just changed the icon. Yeah. So if you look at the uses, then you can see where this is being picked up, right? And for instance, one variable is real investment, the total investment that flows into the economy, right? Or other indicators like investment as a share of GDP, for instance. So you can see exactly where it goes across the board. One interesting feature of the full version, sorry, you don't have it yet, is that you can increase the depth of the analysis. So if instead of 2 steps, I look at 4, then I can see a more complete set of ramifications. Let me go. No, let's say government, where is private investments here? This one. Then you see that this one goes to nominal investment, it goes to industry, it goes to services investment, it accumulates into capital, right? And if you click on capital to expand even more, it goes to a number of different places. It goes to estimate employment, it goes to estimate GDP value added, and so on and so forth. So this is a tool that you can use to navigate back and forth in the model, right? Now, of course, there are other options. If you take the investment, you can navigate through edit, find, you can find the variable, or find again, it takes you to all the sketches where this is being used, right? So if you take this one, and we go edit, find again, you can find it here as an input to the investment for industry. You can continue again or press F3, find again, you will find it in services. Right? So it makes you jump from one part of the model to another. In this case, we are in services. We're not in households anymore. We are down to services. Okay, so the model is very interconnected. It takes a bit of time to explore what these connections are. Okay. Now, to conclude on the economy, if we go to government, now you see basically the same topic, but in this case, represented for government finances, not households. So the starting point is again GDP, nominal production, from which we estimate government revenues, which is the taxation that we are subtracting from disposable income, remember? Because who's paying taxes? Households, in this case. And so here we have other dynamics though. Instead of putting the money aside in savings, in consumption or investment, in this case, pretty much the whole budget is being spent. So that you have your government budget that goes into consumption and investment. Consumption is the salary of public officials, teachers, and so on and so forth, right? Investment will be development expenditure, building roads, and so on and so forth. Public buildings, right? All these other types of investments. Now, of course, as we said, the government normally spends everything that comes in. If there is a deficit, and you find on the right side, there is government financing, that goes into the stock of debt. At the macroeconomic level, the only stock you normally find is debt. Everything else is flows, annual values that don't accumulate. Okay? The only stock that is relevant to the government is public debt, maybe the stock of foreign currency, but that's more of a short-term type of dynamic. But public debt is the most important one. So orange normally are the intervention options. Policies, targets that we introduce, a switch to activate them. So for instance, here on at the center on the left side, you find additional government low carbon investment, right? And this is being affected, we can look at it this way. This is being affected if you use the causes tree. Sorry, I didn't pick it up. Okay, so this additional government investment is affected by a switch that can turn on or off the investment for decarbonization, and we'll see what are the intervention options that we have there, and that nominal additional low carbon public investment. So we have the total investment that the government will need to implement based on the portion that is in fact public, and then we turn on a switch, and then the money flows in. Extra cost, right? The additional low carbon public investment, this is just baseline, don't look at the numbers, it's zero. This comes from investing in chargers, electric buses, electric vehicles, power generation, land-based interventions. So we sum up the ambition and the cost of the ambition and then decide who's paying for it. Public, private sector, donors, grants, and so on. But these orange variables are related to intervention options. Okay, then let's look at GDP and how production, so we look at the private sector perspective, is being calculated. So let's look at industry. So first of all, the capital industry stock, we find it at the top, right? And we find a familiar variable, the investment flowing in. That investment comes from public and private investment. We saw the private investment with households and the public investment with the government. We sum up the two. That is the total investment with the portion going to industry that flows into the stock. Then we have two outflows in this case, not like population, where we have just one flow. We have two outflows. One is the loss of capital due to climate impacts. If you have a flood and the building is damaged, we need to demolish it and rebuild it. Basically, we take it out of the stock. Okay? How do we count? How do we estimate the amount that is lost? Okay, then we go to the climate impacts. We see here, I'll show you the variable. This is the loss of capital due to floods, measured in billion tons. It oscillates based on the strength and the frequency of extreme events, in this case, floods. That's why you have these big oscillations. These are monthly time steps for precipitation variables. Now, if you work backwards, this is impacted by the effect of extreme precipitation on capital. Climate change-related variables are green, normally for impacts. COVID impacts are pink. We kept them in to show how that changed dynamics, and it was important for the first green economy program. But the effect of extreme precipitation on capital is based on the data on precipitation and the forecasts and the climate damage function, basically telling us for a given size of precipitation or extreme event probability, what is the damage to capital? And that's based on maps that show the potential areas at risk of climate change. impacts.
And this data of climate damage also took from another.
We estimate directly. So, well, it's a mix of pieces of information. So first we look at maps and we look at where the buildings are located. And based on a map and where the building is located, we see what are the areas that are prone to floods, and we count the number of buildings in that map.
Ourselves, by just I take this map and analyze this, or we have.
No, this is already done by others, and some we have done myself with my colleagues. Yeah. But you normally don't do it on your own.
They provide your data, and we use this data here. Yeah?
Yes. So we know what is the right method to do things, right? The right approach. In many cases, we don't find the information we need, so we go ahead and we develop them on our own, right? So that's also possible. But in this specific case, this is information that is given to you, that is available and built into the model.
I just imagine about the passengers livestock, yeah? And there is an indicator NDVI, let's say index distributed NDVI.
I remember that we looked at that.
International growth, vegetation.
Vegetation,
Yes.
yeah? And to modelize something, no, to modelize how the livestock will change, we should to make the quantum GIS maps and analyze this NDVI indicator, and then by ourselves took it to the model and make work in that field. Yeah? But here we can use region or data.
We followed exactly the process you described, but applied to climate impacts on, in this case, capital, right? So that you figure out what the method is, right? You need this information, that information, that information. Then I calculate the input I need, and then I build it into the model. We did the same, but for climate impacts, in this case, on productive capital. Right?
I just why did I ask this question? Because I've noticed that in the Vensim there are a lot of green instruments and climate instruments, yeah, and the Vensim created to the climate and green modeling specially, yes?
No.
Is it right? No.
No, Vensim is a software, and you can use it to build any model you want. When I studied system dynamics, I had classmates that worked on philosophy, on social sciences, others that were looking at brain tumors and how the brain develops, for instance. So it's just a software like Excel. Then, with Excel, you can build a project finance model. You can do very simple equations. You can prepare a list of, kids attending my daughter's birthday party, whatever, right? So the same here. This is just a software we applied in my working with the green economy model to green economy topics. But the software can be used for all sorts of other topics.
Research about Vensim, I found information only about climate and green modeling in Vensim.
No, there's plenty more.
But it's well suited to modeling
Sustainable
complex
development
systems.
If you look at the international conference on system dynamics that is organized by the System Dynamics Society, you will find a broad range of topics. It's used a lot in supply chain analysis because of the stock and flow dynamics. It's used a lot in human health, considerably. The sustainable development work is comparatively smaller with respect to the other applications.
More precise.
Can you expand a bit more?
Like as you said, for the Excel, for the normal, like for example, when you do work with numbers, Excel is better. Instead of like usually work on the other. Work for that person every day is the best for the modeling.
I think in any sort of modeling application, it's that feedback dynamic and relationship. Right? If you were to build a model with feedback loops in Excel, you cannot link one cell to the other directly because you have simultaneous equations. And if you want to build a change over time, you need to work through a long series of data, right? And this one has embedded simulation that makes it very, very easy because the stock accumulation is a delay, right? And you have one time step to go from flow to stock. And so that automatically avoids that you have the simultaneous equations to a very large extent, and it makes it easy to connect variables together with one another. To me, it's also more visual, and it helps. In most other models, and you work with data and similar, then you have a link, a list of lines of code, and that's it, right? So we have it here as well. I don't know if you've seen it, but this is the text version of the model. Long series of lines of code and data and so on. There are some people that model this way. Just go to the text version and add in the information. In my case, I prefer to add a variable one by one. It may be a bit more slow as a process, but then I visualize everything. And it offers different features. Okay, so we'll get to climate change soon because there are many other impacts that we can look at. But just to conclude on the economy, we have capital that accumulates over time based on investment, which comes from GDP ultimately, right? But then capital goes on to affect GDP itself, right? So here is a feedback loop. GDP determines investment. Investment accumulates in capital. Capital determines GDP, which in turns determines investment, which accumulates in capital, which defines GDP. So we have a circular relationship in the model. The second one at the macroeconomic level is that the more capital you have, if you go down, the more employment. Because employment is calculated based on capital. The more infrastructure you have, capital is a monetary value, the more people you need to run and use your capital. And so this employment is determined based on the capital that you accumulate and the labor intensity for industry. We have data on employment, we have data on investment and capital. We can determine what is labor intensity, right? And have it change over time based on the availability of labor. But if you have more capital, all else equal, you have more employment. And if you have more employment, second key factor of production together with capital is employment, you have more GDP, right? So that is macroeconomic neoclassical theory. Capital, labor, and technology are driving the economy in a reinforcing fashion.
That approach very useful in educational system like this, universities, because in university we study in linear,
In linear.
A linear approach, yes.
But if we in university use this scheme structures,
Yeah.
I guess we'll get more understanding.
Now, you may remember some presentations I've given in the past with this diagram. Second, this one. I don't know if it looks familiar, but you see GDP at the center? Yeah. You see GDP at the center here. The more GDP, the more investment. The more investment, the more capital. The more capital, the more investment. The more GDP, right? So here we have three variables representing a reinforcing loop. In the model, that is developed over 25 or 30 variables because you take it step by step, you have more detail and so on and so forth, right? In the same way as GDP affects investment, we know investments affect job creation. Job creation affects employment. Employment goes on to affect GDP, right? But then GDP goes on to affect investment again. And you continue, time step after time step, you have that continuous recalculation of the results. That's why economists will say if you trigger growth, no matter where and how, if you trigger growth, it will create a snowballing effect. But if you don't have growth, you create a vicious cycle, right? And then you go into the recession, which turns into bigger depression of the economy, right? And that's why, from an economic point of view, you always need growth. You must have growth. That's the ultimate goal, right? Well, if you're limited to this approach, it's fine. It makes sense. But then let's go back to the model and see that we have capital, we have labor, employment, but then we have another key factor affecting GDP, that is productivity, right? Productivity down here, we can look at it using the tree diagram. Sorry about that, here. Productivity from a neoclassical point of view TFP, total factor productivity, is everything that is not explained by capital and labor. Everything else, right? And so in the most simplistic approach, this was technology. And then if you have economic growth, but you don't have more investment and you don't have more employment, it means that technology is improving. And we know that technology is always improving, right? If we buy something now to replace something we have had, a laptop, a car, a refrigerator, we've had for a few years, the new model is likely more efficient, works better, right? Consumes less energy to provide the same service. And so the idea is that technology is always positive. In reality, though, as we have explored over the years, total factor productivity, first, is not only technology, right? And second, the elements that are not technology may actually get worse over time. And so you see here the other factors that we have. We have emissions as a proxy for air pollution. If air pollution increases, productivity of labor goes down.
Why?
Because we become sick, we cannot work.
And climate change, when we
Mhm.
talk about AC, let's say, technology developed, everybody started using AC, but actually that the overall temperature outside
Increases,
really
yeah.
increases. Yes.
Right.
But people more advanced, they now mastering all the temperatures inside, we talk about those like in the climate change, but actually that increases temperature outside the one, and that's happening to
But that's a side effect in a way that we're learning. So we're learning that there are different impacts that we did not consider in the past.
But at the same time, it's really discussionable topic because effect of emissions on the health, it's we do not have tools on that.
How do you not?
For example, in 2023, UNICEF prepared report correlation between air pollution in Bishkek and the impact on health. And UNICEF wrote that 112 people every year die. At this moment, Ministry of Health in Kyrgyzstan says, "Hey, now where's your proof?" And UNICEF said, "Oh, sorry, and we have this research, and Ministry of Health didn't take to account this report because it's not proven." Yeah, and at the same time, if we take this factor of this parameter, says emissions, impact on health, I guess it will make very deep discussions in society. Yeah.
But you as a mother have to decide what to use and whether to use an input, right? Could be based on a paper, could be
Yeah,
based on a
it's
full
based on
data set.
research. As a rule, you take
It has to be
research.
based on something, yeah.
It's not like
Yes,
Yeah.
same with the electric cars, for example,
Mhm.
so battery is actually destroying the soil.
Mhm.
The technology gets developed, everybody's a solution on the one side. Better, we're going for the traditional, but then actually nobody knows long future.
Right. Yeah. So
Oh,
you're
sorry.
right. No. I want to tell you more about the health impacts.
Sorry.
So the point here is we're trying to integrate knowledge from different fields. So we have to become familiar with best practice in these other fields, right? So how is the impact of air pollution on human health being modeled by the World Health Organization, by the experts in the field, right? And normally you would see you have mortality that you mentioned, but you have morbidity. Morbidity is getting sick and not being able to go to work, right? Or being sick and not being able to model, as quickly as you used to be, right? As you used to do, something like that.
productivity.
Your running nose or whatever, right? Productivity impacts. But then it's not only that, it's the pollution that technically is a stock of air pollutants that stay in the atmosphere. So when it's windy, it takes it away. When it's raining, it takes it down to stormwater and becomes stormwater runoff that is polluted, right? With bubbles and so on, right? So it's the pollution you have in the atmosphere that comes down. So there is a number of extra details that will need to be embedded, right? That you may not be able to address with a model like this one or with any other model that you may be able to use. So you need to simplify and make assumptions. If it's realistic and solid, keep it in. Otherwise, just say, my results do not take into account the effect of pollution on human health. So if I have a scenario with a rapid growth in the use of fossil energy, maybe my model will overestimate growth because I don't take into account the negative impact on labor, right? So you have to interpret based on what is in there or what is not there.
Yes, I understand, but can you just give me advice? Is it right or not? This is green economy. That's
Right.
why it's different approach. Because in traditional economy, in total factor of productivity industry, it's производительность factor of производства, да? In total, in traditional economy, we have energy, habitat quality, roads, and technology. But we do not take into the account the effect of emissions. In green economy, we take it, and that's why there's no new economy way to understand this world in capitalistic reality.
So it's a bit different. In a conventional approach, you just have technology, pretty much. Maybe energy prices.
Not habit, yeah.
Yeah, maybe energy prices,
Yeah.
maybe, right? It's just one external factor.
In traditional economy.
In traditional.
Yes, sure.
In this case, you have emissions, you have habitat quality, you have roads, you have temperature, and maybe a number of other indicators. So we try and make it as comprehensive as it can be.
Okay, great. This is a
Yeah.
conceptual difference between
Right.
economy. Yeah.
But why is this important? Regardless of the indicators you use. We said earlier, when GDP goes up, you have more investment and you have more GDP. But when GDP goes up, you also have more energy consumption, you have more emissions, and GDP goes down. GDP goes in the opposite direction. Or when you have more growth, you build more, you cut down trees, you remove green spaces, habitat quality goes down, maybe you have less water supply. Maybe you have more floods because there is less water absorption in the soil. So you see, we're introducing side effects. We are not introducing more drivers for growth. Those we already have in the conventional. We are adding what the conventional does not explain. That is, there are side effects, right?
Okay, great. I get it. We have to change our economy logic.
Expand it.
Yes, expand.
Yes.
Okay.
Then why are roads important, for instance, in this case? And there could be other factors being added for infrastructure, because climate change affects roads. It
Yes.
creates a crack in the road. While in conventional models, you look at the loss in production. But can you explain loss in production without knowing the impact of roads on the economy? Not really. So you take a top-down approach in conventional economics. With this approach, we try and take a bottom-up joint with a top-down approach. Both.
Да, здесь этот важный момент, вроде это вот, additional да, to the comments of Omar. You said one important point in the beginning that before filling these all the variables in the WinZim, which looks like very complicated,
Yeah.
Modeler develops an analysis and discuss with the professionals, for example, from energy sector, from
Yes.
green climate sector, from transport, logistics, supply chain,
Yeah.
discuss and see what kind of inflows, outflows, and what kind of variables affect each other. So they're developing the methodology, and after understanding the situation, yeah, and the whole picture, after that, they are beginning
Then
to
you build the model.
model.
Yes.
And as I understand, you mentioned that another important point that you said that it could be different variables, not only this one, but many multiple effects variables. It's model. It's
Whatever
assumptions.
is relevant in your own context.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
It's assumption. So it doesn't mean that you should, the modeler, it doesn't mean that he needs to be 100% right.
Yeah.
Because it's model. Because it's
It's exploratory.
Hypothesis you're exploring.
yeah, it's my personal background, knowledge, experience. So based on this, I am modeling.
But we normally say in modeling that if you use a conventional approach, you have certainty coming from the data and the observations that you have, right? So in that case, you can be precisely wrong because you're precise, but you know you're wrong because you're missing out what you cannot measure. Or with this approach, you can be somewhat right. Not 100% right, but since the model reflects reality better, you can be somewhat right. Then some of my clients want to be precisely wrong. Some others prefer to be somewhat right. You never know. It depends on your audience. But I actually, to develop this model, I went through exactly the process you mentioned. I worked for 2 years on the Green Economy Initiative of the UN Environment Program. They had 10 sectoral chapters, one on agriculture, one on buildings, one on infrastructure, and so on and so forth. One lead author, 3 coordinating authors, and 20-something experts for each chapter. And I had to develop a sectoral model for each chapter, working with these experts, so gathering knowledge from them, right, on what are the key indicators, key dynamics, data sources, and then combine them all in one single model.
That's why you are very well familiar with different sectors.
Yeah, then over time you work with more and so on, but that was the starting point. Otherwise, I would not have been able to develop something like this.
That makes sense, yeah.
Right. So, going back to the economy, the important aspect is that we don't only have factors that drive economic growth, but we have the side effects of economic growth. Why is that important for the green economy? Because the idea is that growth does not only come out of pushing more, it also comes out of reducing harm, reducing damage, and reducing costs. Why? Because otherwise, if you build an economy that costs more and more to maintain, you're basically accumulating debt. And at some point, the interest you pay on your debt is more than the money you have to spend. Because if you keep accumulating damage, at some point, you cannot keep up anymore, right? So we want to show that there are 2 ways to develop. One is to grow more, and the other one is to damage less. If you reduce damage, the amount of money you save can be reinvested into other activities. So we have to represent the trade-offs and the side effects explicitly. And these are the impact on human health, could be fatalities from traffic accidents. The more cars you have, the more accidents you have, right? Could be air pollution, it could be water shortages, could be that there is so much being built now that the next big rainfall event generates a flood that otherwise 10 years ago would not have happened, right? Because you have more impermeable. Maybe that could be added as well. Normally we had income and education affecting fertility, but there could be other factors related to pollution, related to other elements. And so this is what you find here. So I wanted to focus on the economy first, because then these dynamics that flow back into productivity are represented in the other sectors, right? So for instance, we have energy demand. This is a fairly complicated sketch because you have a full energy balance in one single sector. But basically we have GDP and population, again, together with energy efficiency, affecting the demand for energy. We account for the price effect, the affordability, to determine what energy source is preferred compared to others, some substitution effect. But then we end up on the right side here with the total demand. Let me zoom in a little bit more. We have up here demand for coal, demand for petroleum products, demand for electricity, for natural gas. And this is demand by sector. So that we have the demand, you see the subscript being used here, that is sector. And in that case, we have industry, transport, commercial, households, residential sector, and other demand. Fully calibrated to match the national energy balance in this case. Now, we know already what happens, right? When we consume energy, the next step is to calculate the cost of energy, because the cost of energy affects total factor of productivity. And then when we consume energy, we calculate emissions, because emissions affect total factor of productivity, right? So unless we invest in efficiency, the more GDP grows, the more is the cost related to emissions and air pollution. Okay? If we introduce energy efficiency, we reduce pollution, but we also reduce spending because we consume less energy. If we introduce renewable energy, we reduce emissions even more, even if you don't cut consumption. So you see, we have strategies to break down these flows and these circular relations in the model, depending on the sector we want to work with. Okay? So what we did for the Green Economy program was to have the list of intervention options by sector. We had 6 or 8 priority sectors, I don't remember, 8 maybe. 8 with finance. And then we had a series of modules for each of these sectors. That's why you find tourism in the list here, for instance. But then we have energy and we have all the other key sectors, right? Because they all can be used, waste management, to implement intervention options, okay? To break these linkages, these feedback dynamics, and make the economy more sustainable. Then an important variable that is useful potentially for the nationally determined contribution, the NDC update, low emission development strategy, and so on, is total emissions. that you see here at the center. This is developed using the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, methodology on the national greenhouse gas inventories. And so we have emissions from industry, IPPU, industrial processes, from waste, from land, from energy, from livestock, from managed soils. And no, this is just Kyrgyzstan, baseline with no actions at first, and then we add the actions as alternative scenarios.
Yes, exactly. When you use data, and the same with IMF, you should take account, for example, not only countries and data, especially be careful with climate change, those emission as well.
What do you mean? That we calibrate using data for emissions or something else? Yeah. Yeah. No, there is now, as part of the NDC process, the UNFCCC provides the guidance, and then each country develops its own national greenhouse gas inventory.
Yeah.
So we use the national greenhouse gas inventory, but we know what is the underlying method. And so we reproduce the method in the model and we parameterize it with country data from the national inventory. So there is consistency between the model and what is being done for the inventory at the country level. Yeah, so if you look at other components, we have a detailed disaggregation on emissions, methane, nitrous oxide. If you're interested in pollution, we have, zoom in a bit more, about 15 different pollutants. This is actually based on work that was done by the Stockholm Environment Institute, building in different pollutants across different energy sources, because different fossil fuels have different chemical characteristics, right? And so we have PM2.5, PM10, methane, nitrous oxide, carbon, CO2, black carbon, organic carbon. So there's a number of different emissions, sulfur oxide, that will change based on the energy mix that you have in the country for power generation and for total energy consumption. So what is interesting is that then you can go in and modify, say, power generation shares. If you want 100% renewables, you can determine how much is solar, wind, biomass, hydro, and then the model will calculate the consumption of fossil fuels going to zero for power generation, which is already low, but going to zero. And therefore, it will change emissions and their pollutants. So that's basically how the model works from a baseline perspective, right? You have your key drivers, you make sure you match the forecasts and the data for these drivers, and then you have all the subsequent impacts. At the policy level, we have a sketch called policy cost estimate. And so this is where we bring in all the costs related to the intervention options that are the orange variables in the model. So if you look at the causes tree in this case, we have livestock emission reduction costs, for instance, in relation to feeding that we did in the past or other options, manure management, energy efficiency, carbon capture and sequestration at the industrial level, always there, but always difficult to back up and confirm. Energy interventions, that would be vehicles, electric buses, chargers, for instance, investment in transmission lines, strengthening them, both capital and operational maintenance costs for power generation, land-based interventions with reforestation, for instance, land restoration, sustainable agricultural practices, waste management with energy recovery, with improved collection and sorting and so on, or waste prevention. So when we run these alternative scenarios and we activate them, we see simultaneously the impact on the flows within the sector, emissions and other key variables, the cost. We can estimate the total cost and we can allocate it between public and private sector, because some of these investments are typically public on the bigger infrastructure projects, and some, like mine vehicles, are typically private, household level. And then we know that this private and public investment is what feeds back into the government and households accounts, what we saw earlier. So that policy is embedded in economic analysis to tell the government, if you invest X or Y, what is your impact? Do you have a positive return on investment or a negative return on investment? Who's benefiting? Is it households? Is it the private sector? and how that changes, debt to GDP ratio may change, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, Andrea, I have a question.
Mhm.
The whole this sketch list for different sectors of the economy
Mhm.
will actually meet as per the goal of the assignment, right? The assignment was, for example, to calculate the measure for policy.
Yeah.
So based on one policy that was like assigned by our government, for instance. So based on this, all these sketch lists were done for one assignment, right?
Yes and no.
Mhm.
Meaning that that's what we did for the first version of the model back in 2020 or so.
But it's not one assignment, it's the whole program
It's
of
the whole
green
program,
economy
but
development. So it's like
our assignment was to
hundreds
analyze
of-
the impact
yeah.
of the whole program.
Yeah.
The full program.
Yes.
Okay.
But the problem had priority areas,
Okay.
sectoral areas, right? And so then that's where we clustered the
Okay.
impacts on different sectors. But this version of the model is the starting version of the green economy model. When I need to work on a new country, this is the starting point. We decided to work on this starting point because we have a lot more inputs on the climate side, since we wanted to add climate adaptation in addition to mitigation and other policies. And so this is a more advanced version, but it's also more generalized.
So basically, we've been working
Mhm.
for this like 4 years in a different version of the green economy model. This is the updated version without all of the interventions that we have already considered. So it's like
But with
brand
more
new,
detail in
but it's
some
more
areas.
detail, yeah.
Template develop like even neighboring countries of the region, something like that, or they publish, so you can also take as
Starting point.
what is the starting point of compare like something like already made?
So I worked with about 50 countries so far. So there is plenty to compare against if you want to. But in the end, each model is customized to the specific country context. So it's not perfectly comparable, right? There's plenty of other models. Yeah, plenty. The World Bank develops models for the Climate Change and Development Report, for instance. There
But
are
different
many.
models.
There
They're
are
not
different
expensive,
types of
they're not green
models.
economy models.
Well, there are. So it's a bit tricky because different models may include different variables and different sectors, right?
So you cannot-
But they also solve the model in different ways, solve the equations in different ways. As I said, we have an anchor and then we have a time step analysis, meaning that the model does not optimize, but many other models optimize. And when you optimize for a point in time and you don't have a full continuous time series. So if you want to compare different methods and models developed for the same analysis, you need to know the mechanics of the models to interpret the results and understand why they're different.
But
But it's possible to compare.
There's some models that use the same variables for every country,
Yeah.
and then you can compare the results for each country. And some models are customized, like this model. It's customized to every country, but it's not exactly the same. So basically, to compare it, yeah. Either it's customized or it's the same, and you can compare it.
So in Kazakhstan, to work on green economy, they decided to use 3 different models: a computable general equilibrium model for the macroeconomy, one optimization model for the energy sector only, and then to use this methodology, system dynamics, to look at natural resources, to look at assets, buildings, and so on. But then merging them is complicated. So you don't really merge them. We call it soft
Updating them,
coupling.
It's like.
Because the output
no.
of one model is used as an input for the other model, but then the output of this model should be used as an input for the other model, and it becomes very cumbersome. Different strategies. The goal for us is to provide that systemic view, right? Not to go into detail. Once you have the systemic view, you can go into detail, but it would be incorrect from a green economy point of view to start detail without having an overview of the system. Coal export and. But that being said, one big issue they have, and it's not in the macroeconomic model, the CG, is the impact on human health, going back to that, for using coal for heating in rural areas where you don't have centralized heating or where you don't have access to new technologies and so on. So there was a lot of emphasis on figuring out what is that cost, right? But that could not be done with the macroeconomic model. So that's where we use system dynamics to do an analysis of different types of buildings in different regions, based on the technology and the energy source they use for heating to see what the impact would be of transitioning away from coal, low-grade coal mostly. So you see the policy questions differ. They're not always the same. So the ideal situation is to be able to have the time and the funding to develop a model that is customized to the context, but then choose a starting point. It could be this one, it could be another one. This is meant to be systemic to cover those needs that are not being addressed by sectoral models.
Did the ChatGPT make your work easier?
No. For better or worse, not yet. Not yet. No. Because if you ask ChatGPT or Grok or others, right, to look for data for you,
Yeah, you have to
it's
recheck
not
everything
very
again.
reliable. Perplexity may be more reliable, but not super reliable because you need something specific, it finds something slightly different and so on.
What about logic?
The logic, you can ask, what are the pathways? What are the factors that impact infrastructure with climate change, right? And we'll tell you the list. It cannot turn it into equations, right? You cannot say, given these data inputs are from climate change, can you estimate the damage? That it will not do. So I think it also depends on how popular the software is. It can read Vensim models, simple Vensim models. So given that Vensim models are run in C++ as the modeling language still, if you have like a 10 variable model, not the green economy model, that will not read, it's too complicated. But if you have a 10 variable model and you say, I don't have Vensim, can you tell me what happens when I change this input from 1 to 5? It will run the model for you and will give you the result for the variables you're interested in. But if you ask to add a new variable, it will not do that. Like if you add new equations, it will not do that. For Excel, very familiar and very popular and so on and so forth, if you ask, I have this time series, I have that time series, I want to do a regression analysis, right? And I want to normalize it based on whatever factor, it will tell you exactly the equations that you need to use. Well, even the free one does that. Yeah. It stops after a few requests, right? And then it can also generate the Excel file for you. So that's the direction where we are going, right? So soon it will change, but for the time being, it's not there yet. And then the other thing, I guess, is that, so I'm not too concerned that I will lose my job. But if I were to be one of those modelers, as you indicated earlier, that builds a model with the same structure for all countries in the world, then I will be concerned. Because if you customize, like what ChatGPT tells you, it's a synthesis of the literature. But our knowledge is not all in the literature, right? So if you want to have an analysis done for Bishkek, you have to come here, you talk to the stakeholders, you figure out what the problem is, and then you build the equations based on your experience. Maybe you ask ChatGPT for input, but it will not tell you, this is the model to use for Bishkek for air pollution, I will build it for you. But if you say, tell me what is the most used, cited air pollution model worldwide, it will probably tell you which one it is, and it can extract the equations if there is a model documentation online, right? So it can build standardized. So far, it cannot do customized, right?
So it's like a good question. Data provided the same as like AI and the panel and the diamond course.
Yeah. Data, I never ask for data because I know exactly my sources. But after years of experience, that's what it is. There, I would see big data offering more inputs to modeling than ChatGPT, meaning that we're looking at traffic. If I want to look for data on traffic congestion, if I actually have access to an historical time series of Google Maps providing traffic data on a minute by minute, and I ask ChatGPT or whatever LLM, right, the language learning machine that is behind those, to process the data and tell me when you have this traffic congestion, right? It will tell me at this point of the day, morning and afternoon, when people start working, and in the evening and so on. And then I can ask, but if you look at precipitation, right, is that a defining factor? And so it can interpolate data on precipitation, again, big data, minute by minute or hour by hour, with traffic, and it does a statistical analysis very, very quickly. But that's what I see it being useful for. Processing data that I can use as an input. But then we need to know that the data source is a reliable data source, right? So we have 3 minutes. And so that ends the overview of the green economy model. But I leave it for you to actually explore the model. Having understood what are the key dynamics and how the variables are calculated and connected with one another via the arrows, you can look at the other sectors and let me know if you have any questions. The model file? Yes, that we have. Yeah. You can, I think you can open it
You
with
can
Vensim.
run it.
You cannot run it, but you can open it and you can see
And
everything. Yeah. To see. Yes.
And also this is a property of Ministry of Economy. So
So if you use it,
yeah.
ask how to cite it. Let's put it this way. Yeah.